Good afternoon, everyone. Just bear with me while I pull up my slides. Hopefully everybody can see that first slide just there. Right, well, yeah, as Adam said, a little bit of a strange situation to be coming to you today, and it's unfortunately the same for everybody around the world. I really hope that we're not going to have too many issues today. I have faith in my internet connection, so everybody keep your fingers crossed that we're going to be okay. In many ways, this is kind of the perfect scenario for a webinar, even though it's an absolutely terrible scenario for everybody around the world. But I hope wherever you are coming from today that you're doing okay and surviving through this time. So with that said, let's get on to what we're going to be looking at over the next hour or so. So we're going to be looking at Power Pivot and in turn something called Power Query, because these two in general, they kind of work together. So this is designed as more of an introduction to Power Pivot and Power Query. This is an absolutely enormous subject. In fact, we have training courses dedicated just to this topic. So obviously in an hour, we're not going to be going into all of the details, but what I want this session to do is really just to serve as an introduction for you. So if you've heard of the terminology Power Pivot, Power Query, but you're not really sure what they are, or maybe you've had a little play around with it and maybe finding it a little bit confusing, I hope this kind of demystifies it a little bit and really shows you the kind of things that you can do with these utilities in Excel. Now, I haven't actually done this topic for a very long time. And as I said, it is a very broad subject. But I will say, please don't worry if you've never heard of Power Pivot and Power Query. We're going to start from the beginning and explain it in full. Now, if you've never attended one of our webinars before, as always, I'll briefly introduce myself. So my name is Deb Ashby and I'm an IT trainer and Microsoft subject matter expert. And I'm based in London in the UK, a very much locked down London at the moment. I've been training Microsoft products for about 13 years and I've been using them for about 25 years. So I've really seen it go through all of its different incantations. So hopefully that qualifies me to be running this training session for you today. Now, let's take a look at what we're going to be covering over the next hour. Now, as I said, I always like to start right at the beginning. I'm aware that we probably have very mixed abilities on the call today. I never like to assume you know anything and go straight into the more intermediate to advanced stuff. We're going to start very basic and work our way up. So the first thing we want to discuss is what is Power Query and Power Pivot and why might it be useful to you? Now, the way that I like to explain this is to really give you a recap of just a regular pivot table. So that's the first thing we're going to do. I'm going to show you how to create a regular pivot table. So if you've never done one before, it's not going to be a mystery to you when we get to Power Pivot. So we'll go through pivot tables, a very quick reminder, and that will help explain to you the difference between just a regular pivot table and what you can do in Power Pivot. We're then going to move on to importing data into Excel from multiple different sources. I'm going to show you some of the utilities you have within Power Query to clean your data. And then we're going to get on to the main event. We're going to be creating a Power Pivot table. I'm going to show you how you can create relationships and also how you can use things like measures and KPIs, which again, maybe not something that you're particularly familiar with. And then finally, at the end, we're just going to do a good old pivot chart just to remind ourselves of how we do that. So first of all, let's deal with that first item on the agenda. What is Power Query and Power Pivot? Well, both of these utilities are part of Microsoft's Power BI utilities, and I will say they are particularly useful if you're someone who needs to import, clean, and analyze large data sets from multiple different sources. And I believe Power Query and Power Pivot were first introduced in the Microsoft applications in 2010, I was reading the other day. So they've been around for quite a long while, but they have, of course, evolved as we've had more recent versions. So that's a very brief explanation as to what they are. They're great for handling large data sets from multiple different sources. Now, in order to demonstrate this, so you can really see what I mean by that statement, we're going to start out by doing just a regular pivot table. So let me jump out of my slides and I'm going to jump across to the data that we're going to be using. Hopefully you can all see that. I know sometimes there is a slight lag, so I will try and account for that as we're going through. So let's talk about regular pivot tables first of all. I have some source data on my worksheet, and if you're familiar with my webinars, you will probably be familiar with this data set. I use this all the time. And all we have here is data, or sales data, I should say, related to two different stores, Computech and Microworld, in various different parts of the UK. So you can see there we have month, we have store, town, store code, country, the manager, the category, and then we have our sales figures. Now, this is a reasonably large data set. If I jump down to the last row, and if you need to jump down to the last row in your data, if you press Control down arrow, that's going to jump you to your very last row. You can see this data set is made up of 21,574 rows. So a lot of data that we have in here. Control up arrow to jump back to the top. Now, ordinarily, what I would do is I would clean any data before I go to analyze it using a pivot table. And I cannot stress to you how important this step is. And it's a step that people tend to overlook. Before you do analysis on any type of data, you must make sure that that data is what we call clean. And there are many things that you can do within Excel to help you with cleaning your data. Now, because this session isn't about cleaning data, I've already cleaned up my data. If you are interested in learning some of those techniques, we do have a webinar available on our YouTube site, which is dedicated to cleaning data prior to analysis. So I would definitely check that out if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But some of the things you might do when you're cleaning data would be to remove any blank rows that you have in your data. Make sure that your case is consistent. So you can see here, my case is all very consistent. I don't have things that are all in uppercase or all in lowercase. You want to make sure that you've removed any duplicate entries. And again, there is a button on the data ribbon specifically related to removing duplicate entries in data sets. And you also want to make sure that you have the correct formatting applied to each column. So if I was to highlight this first column here, the month column, and go to my home ribbon, you can see in my number group, it says date. So this is formatted correctly. If I was to select column H, which contains the sales figures, you can see that that is formatted as currency. So you want to go through and make sure that all of your columns are formatted with the correct data type as well. So those are some of the things that I might do to clean up my data and make it consistent prior to analysis. The other thing that I always do, and I am a huge fan of tables, anybody who knows me knows I just love a table, is that I always put my data into a table prior to analysis. Now I'm going to show you how to do that, a little reminder in a moment, but this data is already in a table. How do I know it's in a table? Well, a few different things. I can see the formatting. It looks slightly different. I have my filters at the top here. Those get put on automatically when you put your data in a table. And also when I'm clicked within my data, if I look up at my ribbons, you'll see that I have a table tools ribbon and a design tab just here. If my data wasn't in a table, I wouldn't have access to this ribbon with all of my table tools on it. Now, another thing I always do, and again, this is an efficiency tip that I would recommend you try and get into the habit of doing throughout Excel, is that I always name my tables. So again, on this design ribbon, if you look in this first group, the properties group, you'll see where it says table name. I have TBL_sales_data. And that is what I have named this particular table. Now, again, it does seem a little bit tedious, but I would stress to you, always get into the habit of naming things in Excel. It's going to make your life so much easier later down the track. And for me, I like to have a naming convention. So if I'm naming tables, it will always start with TBL. So I know that this is a table. There are other things that you can name in Excel. You can name just regular ranges. So if I had numbers in this range just here that I've highlighted, I could name this range. And if it's a range, I might decide to name it RNG underscore and then whatever I want. So that's how I can specify between a range and a table. So I would suggest to you when you're naming, think about coming up with your own naming convention so it's easy for you to identify what's a table and what's a range. Phew. Now, with all that said, this table is pretty much in the perfect format to analyze in a pivot table. So let's do a quick pivot table as a reminder. I'm going to click in my table. I'm going to go up to Insert, and I'm going to say Pivot Table. And you can see here it says select a table or range. It says table sales data, which is my data range. And then it's asking me, where do you want to put the new pivot table? And I'm pretty happy with new worksheet. And I'm going to say, OK. Now, if this is the first time you're ever seeing a pivot table, then this is like a 2-for-1 for you. You're going to get Power Pivot and pivot tables. Now, the way that pivot tables work is it basically takes that source data. And in our table fields over on the right-hand side, you can see we now have all of those column headings available to us from that source data. And I then have 4 areas down below, and I can drag and drop these different column headings into these different areas in order to display my data in a different way. So it really depends what you're trying to analyze, what you're trying to get out of your data. So I could do something very simple. So I could maybe take the, let's say, category, and I could drag it down to rows, and you can see now I have all my categories. I could take my sales data, drop it into values, and now I can see a summary of all of the sales by the different categories. And the good thing about pivot tables is that they're super flexible, so I can start to move fields around to display my data in different ways. So I could get rid of category just by dragging it out, and maybe I could switch that out for manager. And now I'm getting a summary of all the sales by manager. I could add something like town up into the filters area, which gives me this little filter at the top. So if I then wanted to zero in and see all the sales specifically for London for each manager, I can see that as well. And you can move these into different columns and do whatever you like. Okay, so that is a very basic overview of what a pivot table is. Now, it's important to understand that so that you understand how Power Pivot is different. Now, when we're doing a pivot table, all of these fields that I'm using are from one data source. So all of these fields are from this data source table up here. These are the field headings. Now, what Power Pivot allows you to do is basically import data or grab data from multiple different sources. So that could be, maybe you've got some data stored in an Access database, maybe you have it in a text file, maybe you have it in a different Excel spreadsheet. It allows you to bring all of that data into Excel and essentially create one pivot table, but utilizing fields from multiple different tables in multiple different files. Okay, so that is the main difference. So let's take a look at how that all works. Now I'm going to actually delete this because we don't need this. Let's delete that out. And I'm going to show you a few different sources of data. So I'm going to jump across to this Tables tab first of all. Now, what I have on here are essentially 4 different tables. And this last one here, I haven't formatted as a table yet because I just wanted to show you how to do that in case you weren't sure. But these first 3 are already formatted as a table. Now, what do I have in these different separate tables? I have in this first one, I have trip names. So maybe this is a travel company who offer different trips. We have the trip code. In the second table, I have the trip name and I have the activity level of that trip. In the third table, I have the, oh, that shouldn't say trip code. Sorry, let me just make a change there. I have the trip name and I have the duration of that particular trip. And then finally, I have salesperson and office. Now, these kind of essentially look fairly detached from each other. Now, what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to put this this data into a little table. So I'm going to click in my data, I'm going to press Control A, and that's going to highlight everything around where I'm clicked. Now, to put something into a table, the quickest way is to jump up to Format as Table, and then just to keep things consistent, I'm going to select this table style. I'm going to say my table has headers. I'm going to click on OK. So my data is now in a table, and I have my Table Tools ribbon listed at the top. Now, as I said, I like to name all of my tables. So again, if you've never done this before, up to your design ribbon, over to table name, and I'm going to call this TBL because that is my preferred prefix, underscore. We're going to call this one salesperson and hit enter. Okay, so now I have 4 separate tables, and I can see the names of all of these tables by clicking in that name box drop down. You can see I have all of my different tables just here. So trip code, activity level, duration, salesperson. Okay. Now, in addition to these 4 tables, I also have data in 2 separate files. So let me just pull up File Explorer. Oh, wrong one. Hang on. Here we go. So I have 2 different files here. I have sales data for 2017 and sales data for 2018. So let's just open this one here. And what you'll see in this is sales data for this travel company again. So now we have order ID, customer number, trip code, we have the trip name, we have the salesperson, we have the trip price, and then we have quantity. So I have this same data in both of these files. It's just for different years. So this is for 2017. The other file is exactly the same data, but just for 2018. So maybe some of the figures are going to be a bit different. Okay, but essentially we have the same column headings in each of those 2 files. Now, what I want to do is I want to essentially pull into Excel those 2 files, the sales data for 2017 and 2018, and also these 4 tables. And I want to utilize all of the fields in one big pivot table. So let's take a look at how we might do that. Now, we are going to be verging into Power Pivot utilities. And one thing I want to point out is that the Power Pivot ribbon, which you can see up here on mine, isn't there by default. So if you can't see Power Pivot amongst your ribbons, it's something that you need to turn on, and it is an add-in in Excel. So let me just show you where your Power Pivot add-in is. If you go to File and down to Options, and you want to go down to add-ins at the bottom. And right at the bottom where it says Manage, you need to go to COM add-ins and click on Go. And what you should see is something in there that says Power Pivot for Excel. So you probably find if you can't see it, you don't have a tick in that box. So just tick that box, click on OK, and that's going to give you your Power Pivot ribbon. Okay, so make sure that that's turned on first of all. So saying that, let's now pull in all of our different data sources into Excel. And for this, I'm just going to create a new blank workbook. All right, so in order to pull in data into your Excel worksheet, we go up to the data ribbon. Now, the first files I'm going to pull in are these 2 that I have just here. So the sales 2017 and the sales 2018. Now, I have these 2 files in this folder just here. So Power Pivot data. And because I only have these 2 files in this folder, I can essentially import this data folder in order to get these 2 files. So what I can do is I can go up to the Get and Transform data group. I'm going to go to Get Data, and this is where you can pull in data, all different sources. So it depends where you have it stored. I'm going to go to From File, and I'm going to say From Folder. And it's now asking me for my folder path. So I'm going to click on Browse. And I'm now going to navigate to that data folder where those two files are. So please bear with me. I have a lot of files. So let's just jump through. And we want to find Power Pivot. There we go. And we have a data folder. There it is. I'm going to select it, click on OK, and click on OK again. And it goes away and it's now pulling in those two files. Now, once it's done it, it's going to list both of those files. You can see the name, Sales 2017, Sales 2018. And I then have some options at the bottom as to what I want to do next with this data. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, because these two files are pretty much exactly the same, they just have slightly different figures in them, all of the column headings are the same, I'm going to combine them together in one big file. So I'm going to click the Combine drop down and I'm going to say Combine and Transform Data. And again, this can take a couple of minutes, or sorry, a couple of seconds, I should say. And there we go. So it's pulled those two files through. And at the moment, it's giving me a little preview of just this first file. And you can see both of the files listed up there. It's saying the first file is 2017, and it's showing me a preview of the first 200 rows of that particular file. So really it just kind of shows you what it's going to look like when it pulls it into Excel. That all looks pretty good to me. I'm going to click on OK. And again, this can take a couple of seconds. And what will happen is, because I selected to combine and transform, it takes me into the Power Query editor. Now, when we say transform, what we mean is essentially cleaning your data. You can make changes to your data from within Power Query. So this is another great thing. Instead of cleaning up your data prior to pulling it in, you can pull it in, open it in Power Query, and then utilize the Power Query utilities to clean up your data, make changes to your data. So my data is now in one big file. It's combined the two of them together. And there are so many different options in here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will show you a couple that I think are important. On this transform ribbon up here, there's lots of different utilities that you can use to make changes to your data and essentially clean it up. So, for example, if I click on Format, you can see here we have some of those options for changing the case. So if I had this salesperson column, maybe everything was in uppercase and I wanted to change it to lowercase, or what we call proper case, which is what I have here, I could select that column, go to Format, and I can change it using these utilities in here. Trim as well is another one that will trim off any blank spaces, erroneous blank spaces that you have in your data. Again, these are functions in Excel that you could use prior to pulling it in, but you do have these features within Power Query. So it really just helps you clean and tidy your data prior to analysis. Okay. Now, a couple of things that I'm going to do with my data. As I said, my data was clean before I brought it in, so I'm not going to have to utilize too many of these utilities. However, I can see some things in here that I don't necessarily want to analyze. So, for example, it pulls in the source name. So this is just telling me the file name of this data. Now, I'm not going to want to use this in my analysis, so I'm going to remove this entire column. So if I go to the Home ribbon, I have a Remove Columns option, and I'm going to say Remove Column because that one's not really needed. If I look across, I can also see my quantity column here. Now, pretty much everybody in my data has just purchased one trip. So again, I don't particularly need this column because it just says one in every single row. So again, I'm just going to remove that column as well. So now I'm left with the order ID, customer number, trip code, trip, salesperson, and trip price. Now, as I said, lots of other formatting things that you could do here. Another example would be for trip price. You could go to transform and you have options for rounding as well. So you can round up, round down, so on and so forth. Now, something that's super important to do when you're in here is to check to make sure you have the correct data type selected for each column. So again, your data type is listed just here. So you have this little icon, and if you click it, it allows you to select the data type of the data within that column. So I can see here that this has correctly selected that this is a whole number. That's fine. And I think pretty much all of mine are okay. But just so you know, this one here, it says ABC. That means that it is text, which is fine. This one is also text. This one is text. And this one. And then finally, it's showing me that this is currency being displayed in this column. So if you do have something a little bit strange up there, make sure you go in and select the correct data type for your column. Now, something else that we have in this Power Query editor is if you look over on the right-hand side, you can see we have our properties, and my data is just named data. And I'm actually going to change that. I'm just going to click at the start there, and I'm just going to say sales data. And then underneath that, we have our applied steps. Now, this is a great way of tracking what you're doing in Power Query. So you can see here, the last thing I did was I removed 2 columns. So if I wanted to backtrack out of that, and maybe I decide that I want those columns back, you could kind of backtrack through your steps just here. So I could click on the cross, and that will essentially undo what I did. So I now have my columns back. Okay, now I don't want them there, so I'm going to go back in and just remove those columns. And the same for this one again. Okay, so this Power Query editor is really a way just to tidy up your data. Now, once you've got your data into a format that you think is fine, what we then need to do is we then need to load it into Excel. So remember, this is kind of an amalgamation of those 2 files. They've been put together in one big file. So all you need to do is go up to the home ribbon, click the drop down and say close and load to. And again, this can take a few seconds depending on how large your data set is. So let's all keep our fingers crossed that this doesn't crash, because if it's going to crash at any point, it's normally this point. Hooray, we've been successful. So now it's saying to me, import data. And it's asking me, what do I want to import this data into? So I could choose to create a pivot table straight away or a pivot chart. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say only create connection. And I'm going to say add this to the data model. Now you might think, why on earth am I doing that? What this actually does is it creates just a link to your data. It doesn't essentially import it into Excel. And this is why it's so good for large data sets. Imagine if you had a data set of 60 million rows and you decide to import all of that into Excel straight into a pivot table. Your pivot table probably isn't going to be able to cope with that much data. You're going to find problems with Excel. You might find it crashing, all those kinds of things. Whereas if you just create a link or a connection to your data, it's not essentially sitting in your Excel worksheet. And this is why it's amazing for extremely large data sets. So I'm going to say create a connection and add this data to the data model. So let me say OK. And you'll see I get this little pane pop up at the side. And it's loading my data. You can see at the bottom there, it says sales data. I'm just going to collapse this up so you can see a bit better. It says 498 rows loaded. So I don't have an enormous data set just here. But if I hover over, that is my data set that I've just been looking at. It's not been imported into Excel, but I have a connection to it so I can access it. So that's my first data set, a combination of those 2 files that I've imported in as a connection. But there are other files or other tables that I want to pull in as well. If you remember, if we jump back to our Power Pivot workbook just here, I have these 4 additional tables. And I want to pull all of these into Excel as well. So I'm going to close this down and I'm going to say, let's say save. And I'm now going to import those 4 tables into here as well. So I'm going to go back up to data. I'm going to go to get data and I'm going to say from file. Now these 4 tables are located in an Excel workbook. So I'm going to say from workbook. I now need to find that workbook. So again, just bear with me while I go through my millions of files. Where are we? Power Pivot. And there it is. It's this one here, Power Pivot Workbook 2. And I'm going to say import. And again, we might have to wait a couple of seconds. But what it will do is it will scan that entire workbook and it will show me all of the tables that I have within that workbook. And it might be that I want to import all of them or maybe just a select few. And if you click on each one, it's going to show you in the preview what that is. So that is one of the tables that I want to import. Table and the duration. Now, sales data is my original file. Now, I don't actually want to import that one. I just want those 4 smaller tables on the other page. So the ones I want are, I'm just going to click select multiple items, activity level, duration, salesperson, and trip code. Those are my 4 little tables. I'm going to go to the bottom and I'm going to say load to. And again, it pops up this little import data dialog box and it's already selected for me, only create connection and add this to the data model. So what we're building up over here in the right-hand pane is essentially our data model. It just means we're bringing in all of the data we want to use. So I'm going to say OK. And what you should see now happen in that right-hand pane is I have all of those tables are now loading. So it's pulling all of that data in. And again, these aren't particularly large tables. You can see 19 rows, 6 rows, so on and so forth. So now I have all of my data sources from different sources. So I have my first one is 2 files, which I brought in from a particular folder. And then I have just some tables from an Excel workbook. And you could carry on doing this. So if you had more data, maybe in some kind of Access database, you could pull that in. If you've got it stored in SharePoint, something like that. Okay, so you can pull in as much as you like into here. Now, once you have all of the data that you want to use loaded, you can then start to build your pivot table. So I'm going to select my sales data. I'm going to go up to insert and I'm going to say pivot table. Now, when I get my create pivot table dialog box this time, I'm going to select a slightly different option to what I normally would. So you can see it's already selected it for me. It's recognized that we have a data model, which is our tables over here. So it's selected, use this workbook's data model for the pivot table, which is great. And it's saying, where do you want me to put this pivot table? And I'm going to say existing worksheet and click on OK. So now we get this. Now I'm going to close down this queries and connections pane because we don't need that at the moment. But can you see the difference over here from what we had before? Now we have all of our sales data. And if I expand that, I can see all of those field headings. But I also have access to those individual smaller tables. So table activity with the 2 fields, table duration, I have those 2 fields, salesperson, and then trip code. So essentially what I can now do is utilize any of these fields in one pivot table. And that is the difference between a pivot table where you're just using one source of data and a power pivot table where you're utilizing lots and lots of different sources of data. Hopefully that makes that quite clear. All right, so let's do some dragging and dropping around. Now, I seem to have put my pivot table in the middle of the worksheet here, which is fine, but I would normally prefer to have it in cell A1, but I was obviously clicked in the middle of my worksheet when I was doing this. So let's just do something really basic first of all. I'm going to go up to my sales data. So this is my main table here. I'm going to grab, let's grab the trip field, and I'm going to drag it down to rows. And you can see my trips are now listed in my rows. I'm going to take the trip price field and I'm going to drag that down into values. So essentially now I can see the sum of the trip price by the trip name. Now this is absolutely fine because both of these fields that I've utilized are essentially from the same table of data, the sales data table. So I'm never going to have any problems with that. But what if I want to now add in the activity level, which is from a completely different table of data? Let's see what happens. I'm going to add the activity level into this filters area. Now it's put it there at the top, but if I click the drop down and I want to sort my data by all of the active trips, if I click active and click on OK, it doesn't actually work. It doesn't filter anything. And you can see here in that right-hand pane, it says relationships between tables may be needed. So there is actually, at the moment, there is no relationship that's been established between this activity level table and the main table. So nothing links together. Hence why when I'm changing up here, nothing is happening with the data below. So you need to create relationships between your tables. And this is where we utilize our Power Pivot ribbon. So what am I doing here? Let's have a look. I am wanting to use the activity level, and I want to essentially link it to this table up here, this first main data table. So I'm going to jump in to the Manage Data Model button. Now, this opens up a different window entirely, our Power Pivot for Excel window. And what this will show you is at the bottom, we have all of our different tables of data that we're using. So we have our main sales data table. I can click on activity level to see that one, duration, salesperson, and trip code. So I have all of my data loaded at the bottom. Now, what I'm really interested in here is getting an overview of those relationships and seeing how I can link tables together. And by far, at least I find, the easiest way to do this is to go straight up to the home ribbon and jump into Diagram View. So let's click that button. Now, what this does is it shows you all of your tables in more of a graphical representation. And you can move these around. And in general, I will tend to do that. So I like to have my smaller tables. So these ones here, which have the fewest fields, down at the bottom. And then I tend to put my main table above them. So what we want to do here is we want to create links so that it can pull through the correct information. Now, what we were trying to do is we were trying to filter by activity level. So looking at this activity level table down here, you might think that I want to create a relationship between the activity level field and something up here in the sales data. But that's not actually what you want to do. What you want to do is you want to find the field in the table activity level that corresponds to the field in the sales data table. So you're looking for the key, the thing that links these two tables. Now, if I look for the field activity level up here, I don't have an activity level field in this data. However, I do have a trip field, and I also have a trip field down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link this trip field in the table activity level to the trip field in the sales data table. That will essentially link these two and allow me to access this information in activity level. And the way that you create a relationship or a link is very simple, and you always link from the smaller to the main table. So I'm going to click on trip, and I'm just going to drag it and link it to trip up in this main sales data table. And again, this can take a few seconds, but it creates a link between these two fields. And you can see here, if it's green, it shows you that that is a valid link. And we link from the smaller to the larger. This is called a one-to-many link, okay? So now that I've linked the trip field in sales data and the trip field in activity level, if I minimize this down, you can see now that that big yellow message, which was warning us that we didn't have a relationship, has now disappeared. And if I click my activity level and change it to active, Okay, it's now filtering correctly because there is a link there. It's linked, the trip field between the two tables is linked together, which enables me to pull through any other fields in there. It's kind of similar to a VLOOKUP in many different ways. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this is quite difficult to get your head around if you're very new to it. Now, let's do this again. So I am going to, let's remove activity level, like so. And what I might want to do is I'm going to remove, let's remove trip from here as well. And this time I'm using the trip price in values. I'm going to go to a different table at the bottom and I'm going to use this trip just here. I'm going to drag that down to rows. Now again, I'm getting this yellow message because there is no connection or no relationship between this table and the main data table. So I need to go back to my diagram and I need to set up that relationship. So again, I've used the trip code. Sorry, let me minimize that. I don't think I used the trip code. I've used the trip in the trip code table. So let's go to the trip code table. I'm going to grab trip and I'm going to link it to trip up here. Again, if I minimize down, you can now see that yellow message has disappeared and I can now go through and utilize that because I've created a link between those two tables. So this is how you set up relationships. Now, you could carry on going through doing this ad hoc. So you could start moving your fields around. Whenever you get that yellow message, you can go in. Alternatively, you could do it at the beginning. So you could go through and link everything to this main table first of all. So if I'm to go through these, I have my activity level linked, that's fine. What about this one, table duration? So if I want to use the duration field, if I look in my main table at the top, I have no duration field. But what is the common field between the two tables? Again, it's trip. So I'm going to link this trip to trip. And then in my salesperson table, if I want to pull through the office field or utilize the office field, again, I don't have the office field in my main data, but I do have salesperson. So I can select and link it to that. So essentially, I now have all of my smaller tables linked via the common field in this diagram. So when I minimize this down, I now should then be able to move things around and organize everything as I want without getting any errors. So let's remove trip from rows. And this time I am going to select, let's say salesperson. I'm going to drag that to rows. And maybe I want to utilize the office field. And because we've linked the salesperson, this should work fine. I'm going to add that to filters, and it does. I'm not getting any error. So I could now filter by office, and I'm going to say Cardiff. Let's select multiple, Chicago, Hamburg. And there we go. Everything is working nicely. So that is how you can pull in data from loads of different sources, link the tables together so you can then utilize all of those different field headings in essentially one pivot table. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Now I'm going to drag our office. And I'm just going to stick with these, this data here. So I have my salespeople listed, and I have the amount in dollars of trips that they've sold. Now I'm going to show you a couple of little things here. These aren't necessarily related specifically to Power Pivot. These are pivot table things that you can do, but I think these are also really very useful. Now, what I might want to do here is currently this isn't sorted in any particular order. So what I could do is I could right click, I could say sort, and I'm going to say largest to smallest. So I can now see that Ben is the salesperson who has sold the most in monetary terms, sold the most trips essentially. Now, what if I wanted to maybe get a number of trips that each salesperson has sold? Well, what I can do is I can drag another trip price field down to here. So essentially, I'm dragging another one of these. So I'm going to say trip price. I'm going to drag it down underneath. And it creates another column. Now, it's exactly the same because it's the same field. It's just giving me the sum of trip price, and it's called it sum of trip price 2. But what I could do here is if I wanted to see the number of trips each person has sold, I can go down to my values area, and where I have sum of trip price 2, if I click that drop down, I can go to value field settings, and I'm going to change this name to trips sold. Oops. This time I'm going to say do a count instead of a sum, and click on OK. So now I can see who has sold the most trips, and I can see currently that is still Adam. It doesn't seem to have taken my my title there. Let me just go back in. Hang on a second. Oh, I did that. Let me just do trips sold again. There we go. Okay, so now I can see that Adam is way out ahead here with the number of trips sold. So despite the fact that Ben had sold the most in monetary terms, Adam has actually sold the most trips. Well done, Adam, is what I say. Now, something else that we might want to do here is we might want to find out the average price per trip. So who is selling the most on average each time they make a sale? So again, I'm going to grab trip price. I'm going to drag it down to values. And this time, if I click the little drop down and go to value field settings, I can select average. And I'm going to change this to say just average, like so. And click on OK. So now I get something completely different. And again, I could go in, I could right click, I could sort largest to smallest. So now I can see that even though Ben sold the most in monetary terms and Adam sold the most as in how many trips, Vicky is actually the person who's averaging the best per trip sold. So I'm getting all kinds of different ways of looking at my data. So utilizing things like this by dragging the same field down and just changing the data you're displaying allows you to see information that you didn't necessarily have in the source data that you used for your pivot table. So it's a great way of doing things like that. Now, the reason I wanted to show you that is because I wanted to go into the Power Pivot Tools, the Measures tool, which will help you do something fairly similar. So I'm going to remove this average field, and I'm going to drag it out of values just to get rid of that. Now I could do an average in a slightly different way. So I'm going to go up to Power Pivot, and you can see here on the Power Pivot ribbon, I have something called Measures. I'm going to click the drop down, and I'm going to say I want to add a new measure. So it's asking me, this is basically going to set a measure up as an additional field in my Power Pivot table. So it's saying to me, where do you want me to add this field? Now I'm happy for it to be added into the sales data table, which is the main one at the top. I'm going to call my measure average. And then what I could do is I could use this measure to work out what the average sales are. So you can see here in this box, it says formula, and I have an equals sign. So if I press the square bracket on my keyboard, it automatically brings up some things that I could do. So if I want to work out the average, I'm essentially going to do the sum of the trip price divided by the number of trips. So I'm going to say sum of trip divided by, if I do a square bracket again, count of trip. I want it to format it as currency. I'm happy with it to stay on US dollars with 2 decimal places. And I'm going to say, OK. And there we go. So it does something very similar, but it's set it up as a measure instead through Power Pivot. Now, something else you might want to do is once you've got this average, and there are all different kinds of calculations you can do, and that's why these measures are great. You can add as many measures as you like, and that is definitely something, if you think this might be useful to you, something for you to read further about, all the different ways that you can utilize measures. But now something else I might want to do here is I might want to measure the key performance indicators. So I'm going to jump up to KPIs. I'm going to say I want to add a new KPI. And this takes me into here. So it's telling me I want this KPI based on the average column. So it's going to base it on these average figures. And maybe what I want to see is I want a visual indicator. So you can see these icon styles I have at the bottom, a visual indicator that tells me who is on target, who is just about right, and who is below target. So what I can do here is I can define my values. So looking at my data in this average column, they're all fairly sort of similar, but I'm going to say that my target is 2,100. If you look at this threshold bar below, you can see it's put that target just there, that little line. And what I can now do is drag these up. So I'm going to say if somebody reaches 2,100 average sales, then they're doing amazing. They're going to get a green icon to show that they're doing amazing. And then I can specify the lower threshold. Now, all of mine are fairly close together. So in order to get this to demonstrate correctly for you, I'm going to drag this all the way up to 1,900 because I only have one person, that is Adam, who is averaging underneath 1,900. So you can set your thresholds however you want. You can then select your icon styles. I'm going to keep it on this little traffic light system. I'm going to say, okay. And what it gives you is another column that says average status. Now, you might be a bit confused as to why you're not getting your indicators. You're getting these strange numbers for some reason. And if somebody knows, you can explain this to me. But what you need to do is go back into your pivot table fields and find your average indicator just here. So I'm going to expand it. You can see it has a tick in the status field. If you just remove it, and then put it back in again, it gives you your indicators. So I can now see as a visual representation who is below target, so that is Adam, unfortunately, who is sort of on target, so that might be Deborah, Drew, and who is above target, who is exceeding the target, so Ben, Brooke, and Vicky. And again, that is just one KPI. There are so many different measures, KPIs that you can add in. But again, it just helps you visualize your data and see your data a little bit clearer. So having said all of that, I just want to finish off with just doing a very, very basic pivot chart in case we've all forgotten how to do a pivot chart. Now I'm going to remove some of these fields because I have quite a few now down here. I'm going to get rid of average status. Let's get rid of all of these and just go back to our very basic salesperson and the amount of trips that they've sold. So just as a very brief reminder, if we want to convert this data into a chart, we click in our pivot table. We can go up to our pivot table tools, go to the Analyze ribbon and select our pivot chart option. And there we have all of the different charts. There are so many of them for you to choose. I'm going to do a basic column chart, click on OK, and there we have that data represented as a column chart. And remember, when you are utilizing pivot charts, you have 3 additional ribbons at the top to help you organize, manage, and format your pivot charts. So some things that I might want to do on this pivot chart. This is a very basic one, but I don't really need these little gray filter buttons. So I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say hide all fill buttons on chart. I don't really need this legend either because all I'm displaying here is I just need to see the salesperson and how much they've sold. So I don't really need this legend. So it is a text box. I can just delete it out and that gives me a little bit more room. And I could add a title if I wanted to, which might be something along the lines of sales by salesperson. And of course, there's a whole host of different formatting options when it comes to charts. I could add some labels, axis labels down here by clicking the plus. I can add things like axis titles and chart titles, data labels, so on and so forth. So much you can do when it comes to formatting charts. Whew. We've got about 4 minutes left. Hopefully, I know that's just a very brief introduction, but hopefully what that has shown you is the potential that you have when it comes to bringing in data from lots of different sources, and particularly very large data sets. Because it's not crammed into your Excel file, you're not going to have any worries about your Excel file crashing because you've just created a link to the data as opposed to pulling it in. And then you can mix and match and utilize fields from multiple different tables in one pivot table, as long as you've created those relationships. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave the last 3 minutes for questions. So I'm going to hand over to Adam and just see if anybody has any questions.
Hello, Debs.
Hello.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Mind expanded for sure.
Mind blown.
Yeah, indeed. And always a pleasure to be featured as one of the data points in your webinars.
Yeah, you weren't doing very well in the sales, unfortunately. So.
Stack 'em high, sell 'em cheap, I think, was my mantra for that particular one.
Slacker of the month, that was you.
We've got a couple of questions. One of them is actually about Power Pivot and Power Query, since it seems to me that Power Pivot table is created by Power Query, or am I wrong? So basically, what's the difference between them? Have you got a way of explaining that?
As in how you? I know what you mean. I know what you're saying. So, like with the pivot table, you go to insert pivot table, and you're sort of saying, well, how do you get to this if you've got multiple tables? It all comes through. It starts with you importing your data. So you have to go to the data ribbon, essentially pull in all of your data from whatever the sources are, and it will open this pane.
And is that the Power Query part, basically, that you're doing?
Power Query, yeah. Power Query comes up when if you decide to transform your data. So let me just show you again, if it will let me. Hang on one second. So if I was to import my data again from folder, I've got to browse to it. Hang on one second. So many folders, and this is Adam's fault that I have this many. If I was to import my data from my data folder, like so, I don't know if it's going to let me do it as I've already got it. Yeah, so what it will do is it will find the files that I want to import. Now, depending on which one you select, depends on if it's going to open in Power Query first. Power Query allows you to clean up your data. So if you want to make changes to your data, you can transform the data, the button here, and that will open up Power Query, which will allow you to make changes to your data.
That's right. Yeah.
What I did
once you're in Power Pivot, you can't do stuff like delete columns or things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you either need to clean your data first, just in Excel with normal data tools, or if you don't bother doing that, when you bring it in, if you click Transform Data, it's going to open Power Query, which will allow you to clean up your columns, do all of that kind of stuff. Right. What I did was Combine and Transform Data. Okay, because these two files are exactly the same, so I combined them into one long file, which is the combine bar, and I also transformed it, which then opens them in Power Query.
Gotcha.
As it will.
That makes sense. And Benjamin, who asked a question, has said he's got it, which is great. So thanks for that.
Cool.
And then just one other question, I think, from Jean is: can you put the fields in Power Pivot in alphabetical order? So I think when you were looking at the tables in the actual Power Pivot window, is there a way of alphabetizing them?
In here?
Yes, I believe so, or in the Power Pivot window. I mean, that's just a reflection of that. Yeah.
I don't think so, because I think it picks them up from...
It pulls it from the data source,
data,
doesn't it?
Yeah. So it's going to pull it from... I don't know where my source data has gone now. I think I closed it down. But it will basically pull it from your source data. So whichever order your columns are in,
is the order it comes in.
It's going to pull it into Power Pivot. So, I mean, if you really want them in alphabetical order, you could, I guess, rearrange them prior to putting it into Power Pivot, but it is going to pull them in the order that you have them in your source data.
So I think I see what you're saying there, Gene. If it's easier to sort of create a relationship, then yeah, maybe have if you're going to use a certain column like trip, make that the first column in all the data sources that you're using, and that makes it a bit simpler to then create a relationship once you're in Power Pivot.
The biggest thing with these relationships, because I find that the one thing that people are going to get confused by is when you get to this part and you're and don't get me wrong, sometimes when I'm doing it, I get confused as well.
It looks confusing, doesn't it? Yeah.
It does. But the way that I try to remember it is you have your main data table at the top. Everything has to link through. If you want to use these tables, there has to be a common field between each of these tables and the main table. So it's like VLOOKUP in that way. If you're used to using VLOOKUP, you have to have a piece of information that's common between the tables.
Your lookup criteria, effectively.
Lookup criteria. So in this one, it's trip. In this one, it's trip. In this one, it's salesperson. And this one, trip and trip code is up there. Okay. Right. So as soon as you link the common fields, it allows you access to the fields which don't exist in this initial bigger table.
Yeah, that makes sense. Brilliant.
It's the best way I can explain it.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's provided some clarity. Thanks so much.
No worries.
I've just got a couple of other quick things to say to the few people that are left on. Thanks for hanging around, guys. We do actually have a Power Pivot, Power Query and DAX course that we're working on right now. So it will it goes into more detail, obviously, than we've been able to go into today, and it takes some of these sort of concepts that we've looked at and goes even more advanced. So that should be coming out in April at some point. And in terms of other new courses that are available to you guys as members, QuickBooks Online is just in the process of being released, as is QuickBooks Canada. And we should also have an Outlook 2019 course ready in early April as well. In fact, the two QuickBooks courses should be live on Simon Sez IT and StreamScale tomorrow at some point. Just putting the final kind of editing touches to them. So yeah, loads of new content coming your way in the coming weeks, which if you are stuck in isolation, hopefully it can keep you occupied and your mind busy, so you're not thinking about where to get the next roll of toilet paper from, which certainly occupied minds around here. Indeed. Thanks so much, everybody. I think we'll leave it there unless there's anything else you wanted to say, Debs.
No, I am good. I just hope everybody stays safe and well over the next few weeks. Hang in there. We'll all be okay.
Indeed. Yeah, no, stay safe, everybody. And yeah, we will be back in April. We've got dates. We're just sorting out topics, and so we'll be putting those up soon in the normal place, and you'll be getting emails about them as members as well. So yeah, we're going to do a next one in April, probably an Excel one in April.
Yep.
And yeah, we'll see you all then. Looking forward to it.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.